Sometimes the weight doesn't come from what's done to you. It comes from what no one dares to undo. He walked into that courthouse like he always had. Same coat, same silence, same keycard worn thin from years of doors opened, floors cleaned, and people passing him by like he was furniture. But today, he carried something different. Not a mop, not a broom, just an envelope, and the kind of truth people only write when they think no one will ever read it. What happens when a man who spent his life staying quiet is forced to speak without saying a word? This isn't just a story about a courtroom. It's a story about the fine line between being overlooked and being erased, and what it takes for one man to stand when the world keeps walking past. So sit with this moment, because once it begins, you may never see silence the same way again. It was 6:13 a.m. when Elias Monroe stepped off the number 4 bus and into the bitter Minnesota wind. The snow hadn't fallen that morning, but the cold pressed down like wet wool, clinging to everything: his coat, his breath, even his thoughts. The courthouse sat at the end of First Avenue, a brick building that looked more like a community college than a place where lives were sentenced. He knew the hallways by heart. He had walked them as a janitor for nearly 5 years, invisible to most, unnoticed by many. But today, he carried something that made his steps feel heavier. A manila envelope, sealed tight. Inside, a handwritten witness statement from a homeless veteran named Curtis Lane, a man no one would believe except Elias. Because Elias had taught Curtis to read again, had brought him food, had listened. And now Elias was here to deliver Curtis's truth on behalf of someone else entirely. Mason Everett, 16, black, foster care since age 9, accused of stealing a pack of bagels and a bottle of orange juice from a corner market, charged as an adult. Elias knew the boy, had seen him huddled by the library heating vents in winter, reading from donated textbooks, had handed him sandwiches, had seen a flicker in the boy's eyes, something that once lived in Elias's own classroom before life shifted him into silence. He could have mailed the documents, could have passed them through legal aid, but time was short. The testimony had just come through the night before Curtis had scribbled it with shaky hands on a stack of diner napkins Elias transcribed afterward. If it didn't reach courtroom 6A by 7:45 a.m., the statement would never make the official docket. So he showed up early, quietly, as always. But quiet can look suspicious when you're old, black, and in a space no one expects you to enter. Elias stepped through the service entrance with his ID badge clipped neatly to his faded janitor uniform. The badge was old, slightly discolored. Some of the letters on his last name had faded, still legible, still his. He nodded at the security camera. No one at the front desk looked up. Down the hall, toward the judicial wing, the lights were still buzzing to life, casting dull halos over waxed tile. Office doors were shut. The whole building yawned like it hadn't fully woken up. Elias stopped by the clerk's submission box, but it was locked. A taped note read, "Submissions temporarily moved to courtroom desk 6A." So he turned and headed that way, envelope still pressed to his chest like a passport across a border no one had explained. And that's where he crossed it. The line wasn't painted, it wasn't signed, it was cultural, institutional, a hallway labeled "Court personnel only," but without a door, just a turn. Just enough to make someone decide if you belonged. And someone did. "Excuse me, sir. You can't be here." The voice was young, flat, practiced. Officer Lucas Bray, 25, transferred last month. His belt looked too new, like he hadn't worn it through a full shift yet. His hand rested near the taser, not because Elias looked threatening, but because uncertainty always trembled next to control. Elias turned slowly. "I'm just dropping off a statement," he said, calm. "Witness testimony for the Everett hearing. Room 6A. Bray's eyes darted to the envelope, then back to Elias's face. He didn't ask what was in it. "You work custodial, right?" "I do," Elias replied. "But I'm not here for maintenance." "You're not allowed back here. That's a restricted zone. There was a sign, Elias said, motioning gently toward the note on the clerk's door. Courtroom desk. 6A. Bray didn't move. He seemed caught between policy and posture. I need to see ID. Elias slowly reached for his badge. Bray's hand twitched near the holster. I said slowly. I am, Elias answered softly. He handed over the ID. Bray barely looked at it. You can't submit documents as staff. I'm not staff today, Elias said. I'm a citizen, just delivering truth on behalf of someone who can't deliver it himself. That's when the tone changed. Bray's shoulders squared. His voice tightened. I'm going to need you to place that envelope on the floor and step back. Why? Because I said so. Elias blinked, not in defiance, not even in disbelief, just resignation. So it's happening again, he thought. He looked past Bray, down the hallway toward room 6A. The door was open. A light was on. So close, but not close enough. I assure you, Elias said gently, there's no threat here. Just words, typed, signed, and quietly begging to be heard. But Bray had already radioed it in. Possible, unauthorized individual in judicial corridor. Subject non-compliant, carrying unidentified package. Unidentified. Elias almost smiled, not from amusement, but from the sheer worn-out absurdity of it. The hallway began to fill. 2 more officers arrived, Doan older, one silent. They didn't ask questions. They didn't ask him anything. They just spread out around him like a formation around a hazard. Someone passing through the rotunda whispered, What'd he do? Another replied, Not sure. Some guy back there with something in his hands. Elias lowered the envelope to the floor, slowly, deliberately, as if setting down a child. And then came the command. Turn around, hands behind your back. He didn't move at first. Not from resistance. From memory. He had heard that phrase before, not in this building, but years ago in Birmingham, as a boy, when his father was asked to explain what he was doing on a sidewalk at night with a bag of groceries. Back then, his father complied too, just like Elias would now. He turned. He placed his hands behind his back and felt the click of cold steel against his skin. In that instant, the hallway once so empty was suddenly too full. Phones appeared, angled subtly downward. People who wouldn't speak still recorded. Their silence wasn't protest. It was protection. Distance. A legal intern peered from behind a file cart and frowned. A clerk across the hall froze mid-sip of her coffee. No one said a word. No one ever did. Elias stood there, cuffed, while his envelope remained on the tile floor, inches from his feet. No one picked it up. A janitor in handcuffs was no longer neutral. He was a disruption, a cautionary tale, an inconvenience no one wanted to get involved with. Bray leaned in, voice low and close. You should have stayed in your lane, old man. And that was it. That single sentence carved a clean, brutal line through the moment. Not because of what it meant, but because of how easily it was said. As if Elias didn't belong anywhere else but exactly where he'd just been put. He was led past room 6A. The door was now slightly ajar. Through the crack, he saw Mason Everett seated at the defendant's table, shoulders slumped, hoodie too big, hands fidgeting in his lap like he already knew what this day would bring. He didn't see Elias, but Elias saw him. And that, more than the handcuffs, more than the silent crowd, was what hurt. Because Elias hadn't come to be noticed. He came so Mason could be. But now, the one person whose voice might have made a difference had been stripped of it right outside the door. They took him down a back corridor used for defendants in custody. It smelled of Lysol and regret. Everything about it echoed of misplacement. They put him in a temporary holding room. No bars, just a chair, a wall, and a mirror that wasn't really a mirror. No one asked if he needed water, or his name. They called him the Janitor when they spoke into radios. And all the while, the envelope remained where he left it. On the floor, alone, unopened, unimportant. He sat, breathing slow, not because he was calm but because panic, for him, was a luxury he had long since learned to suppress. He closed his eyes and felt his own pulse, grounded himself in silence. He had taught entire seminars about silence, its moral weight, its complicity. He never thought he'd be wrapped in it like this. He remembered a line he used to tell his students. The line between justice and prejudice is rarely drawn in ink. It's drawn in glances, in questions not asked, in the assumptions we fold into silence. And now, that line was wrapped around his wrists. A few minutes passed. Maybe 10, maybe 20. He didn't count. The longer he stayed there, the more the building woke up. Voices in distant offices, the rustle of papers, the buzz of pre-trial motions. Yet no one came. Until they did. A woman in a gray blazer, mid-50s, sharp eyes and tired posture, one of the building's administrators. She opened the door with an odd look, not quite panic, not quite calm. "Mr. Monroe?" He looked up. "Yes. I need to verify something with you." He nodded once. She sat across from him, set a folder down, opened it. Inside were photos, credentials, a printed transcript of an old ethics lecture, his signature in blue ink. "I received a query from the State Judicial Office," she said. "There's a hold on your name from the retired Ethics Oversight Board. I just needed to ask, is it true you served as senior advisor to the Minnesota Judicial Ethics Commission from 2002 to 2014? He met her eyes. "Yes." She exhaled. Not relief, not disbelief, just wait. "Why didn't you tell them who you were?" she asked. "Because who I was doesn't matter," Elias replied. "Not if they refuse to see who I am." She said nothing, just stared at the cuffs on his wrists, then stood, left the room. Silence returned. But this time, it wasn't complicity. It was tension. It was transition. A crack in the frame. A pause before the frame breaks open. And for the first time that morning, Elias smiled. It was faint, but it was real. They didn't remove the handcuffs. Not even after the administrator walked out. Not even after someone in a press shirt came in to check on the situation, only to leave 5 minutes later muttering something about higher-ups needing to sort this mess out. Elias remained in that holding room for 47 minutes. No one spoke to him directly. No one looked him in the eye. He existed, but only barely like background static in a conversation no one wanted to have. He wasn't angry. Not yet. Anger requires fuel. What Elias felt was far colder. The familiar hollowness of being categorized, not understood, not questioned, just placed. As if someone had seen a shape in the shadows and decided it must be dangerous because they didn't know its name. Across the courthouse, the day moved forward. Room 6A resumed session. Mason Everett, who had been told someone was coming to submit evidence on his behalf, sat quietly beside his court-appointed attorney, wondering if maybe Elias had forgotten. He hadn't. But the system had. Back in the holding room, Elias's shoulders ached. The cuffs dug deeper each time he shifted. The room was cold, not freezing, but purposefully uncomfortable, like someone had designed it to sap your strength just slowly enough that you wouldn't notice until you gave up. He heard movement outside, voices, then silence. Always the silence. It wasn't new. He had sat in silence before, the kind that comes after a colleague at a university luncheon calls your speech surprisingly articulate, and no one corrects them. The kind that settles in after you ask a question at a board meeting, and the room just moves on. Not because they didn't hear you, but because they didn't expect to need to listen. The silence wasn't just around him. It was inside the people who passed him in the hall, the clerk who glanced up from her desk and looked away again, the 2 officers still posted outside, who hadn't asked a single question since the arrest. It was the kind of silence that keeps systems running smooth, clean, uninterrupted by doubt. If you don't say anything, maybe it wasn't that bad. If no one intervenes, maybe it wasn't really wrong. But silence doesn't erase harm. It just delays its reckoning. And Elias knew that, because he had written about it, because he had lived it. Because in the absence of noise, people will tell themselves any story that helps them sleep. The door opened again. A different woman entered, younger, nervous. She was a junior clerk from the regional judicial office, sent to verify something about the chain of custody. But when she saw Elias, something in her posture changed. She blinked. You're Elias Monroe? Her voice cracked slightly. Elias didn't nod. He didn't have to. She stepped back half a pace, almost instinctively. Not from fear, from recognition, from embarrassment. I studied your writing in ethics law. She said it like a confession. Seminar on Judicial Assumptions, University of Minnesota. Elias simply looked at her. She swallowed. I'll be right back. She left the door open behind her. That was new. For 20 seconds, Elias stared at that open doorway like it was a wound, not because he could escape, but because someone had finally left something exposed. Down the hallway, murmurs grew louder. Someone said his name again. A few minutes later, the door opened wider. A federal liaison stepped inside, middle-aged, black, calm. He didn't wear a uniform, but his presence was sharp. He didn't speak at first. He just looked at Elias. And then, with the slightest bow of his head, he said, "We're correcting this. Right now." The handcuffs came off. Elias exhaled, not from relief, but from pressure release. His wrists stung. Red marks circled the skin like quiet reminders. Still, he didn't rise. "Has the envelope reached the judge?" he asked. The liaison paused. "We're retrieving it now." Elias stood slowly. His knees cracked. He steadied himself on the edge of the table, then reached into his coat, the inner pocket where he kept a folded copy of the statement. The original was gone, possibly discarded or sitting in an evidence bin, but the second copy remained handwritten, smudged from a long walk in the cold. "Get this to room 6A, he said. "Right now." The liaison took it with both hands, respectfully, not like paper, like something alive. By the time Elias stepped out of that holding room, the energy in the courthouse had shifted. Not loudly, not visibly, but tangibly. People now looked at him, really looked. Not everyone knew who he was. Some still thought he was a janitor, but now they looked longer, softer, sharper. That's what the truth does when it leaks out. It doesn't shout. It stains. A bailiff apologized under his breath, eyes darting away before Elias could respond. A senior judge crossed the hallway and simply nodded once, as if to say, "I heard. I didn't stop it. I should have." In the elevator up to courtroom level, Elias stood between two clerks, whispering about protocol violations and chain of command. Neither said a word to him. He didn't mind. He was tired of people speaking only when they wanted to feel better. Outside room 6A, the door was closed again. Mason's hearing was ongoing. A sign taped to the door read, "Do not enter during testimony." Elias sat down on a wooden bench across the hall. Same place he'd started his morning. But this time, people noticed him. This time, his presence wasn't background. But presence doesn't erase pain. It doesn't undo a moment. It doesn't uncuff wrists or unhear a voice that said, "You should have stayed in your lane." It just sits there, like an echo, like proof. Inside the courtroom, his envelope had made it to the judge's desk. Mason's lawyer now held the statement in his hand, reading through it slowly, his eyebrows rising in disbelief as he pieced together what the testimony meant. Curtis Lane's words were simple, uneven, but honest. He had seen Mason that day, had spoken to him, had offered him food. Mason had refused, had insisted on paying. The theft didn't happen. The accusation had come from someone who assumed not from what they saw, but from what they believed. And just like that, the narrative shifted. One voice, nearly silenced, now finally heard. Back in the hallway, Elias looked down at his palms. They bore no wounds, but they carried a weight no MRI could detect. A clerk approached him quietly. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." Elias met her eyes. "Don't apologize to me," he said softly. "Ask yourself why you didn't say anything earlier." She nodded, said nothing more. Silence again. But this one tasted different. Not complicity, but consequence. The moment didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It came in whispers, in glances, in the shuffle of courtroom binders and the slow turning of heads. At 10:41 a.m., the courtroom fell into a strange kind of stillness. The prosecutor had just wrapped his second argument on the unreliability of street witnesses. Mason Everett sat motionless at the defendant's table, his hands folded so tightly they looked fused. His lawyer, Dean Hollander, seemed distracted until he received a manila folder slid across the table without a word. He opened it. Inside was Curtis Lane's statement, officially transcribed, signed, time-stamped, and notarized by the administrator who had just spent the last 20 minutes verifying everything Elias Monroe had ever done for the Minnesota judicial system. Dean scanned the first paragraph once, then again. By the third time, his hand rose into the air. "Your Honor, the defense respectfully requests a recess for evidence review." The Judge Hahn. Margaret Sandell him carefully. "We're in the middle of closing arguments, Mr. Hollander." "I understand," Dean said, voice steadier now. "But I've just received a sworn statement from a third-party witness that contradicts the prosecution's entire timeline." Sandell leaned forward. "Where did this statement come from?" Dean hesitated. "From a civilian courier. His name is Elias Monroe." The name lingered in the air for a second, just long enough to awaken something in the judge's eyes. Outside, in the hallway, Elias still sat on the bench, hands unclenched now, but mind pacing. Then the door opened. A court officer stepped out. "Mr. Monroe, the judge is requesting your presence inside, as a material verifier." Elias didn't flinch. He simply stood. But others did. The hallway stilled. Phones rose, not filming yet, but ready. He walked through the courtroom doors quietly, with no badge, no uniform, no title pinned to his chest. Just a charcoal gray coat, a still bruised wrist, and a presence that made people sit up straighter without knowing why. He was asked to take the witness stand not as a character witness, but as the one who delivered and authenticated the statement. Judge Sandell peered over her glasses. "State your name for the record." "Elias Monroe." Her eyes narrowed. "Have you submitted sworn testimony before?" "I have, Your Honor." "When and where?" "Federal court. Twice in Washington, once in St. Paul. As senior advisor for the Minnesota Judicial Ethics Commission, and once more for the Federal Appeals Court in 2010, regarding administrative review." She blinked slowly. The prosecutor turned a shade paler. A murmur swept the gallery. Judge Sandell leaned back, her posture different now. Not just judicial, but personal. "Mr. Monroe," she said, "I believe we've met before." Elias nodded once. "We served on the same panel during the Dignity in Sentencing Symposium. You read a draft of my paper." She paused. And then, something shifted in her tone. "I remember," she said. "You wrote, 'Justice must not only be done, it must be recognized, especially by those whom it routinely overlooks.' It wasn't just recognition. It was recalibration." In that moment, Elias was no longer the janitor with a suspicious envelope. He was the philosopher who had once lectured this very judge on the ethics of silence. And now, he was reminding her, without raising his voice, why that lecture had mattered. Across the aisle, the prosecutor quietly closed his binder. Judge Sandell called for a 15-minute recess, but no one left their seats. Dean Hollander approached Elias at the side of the bench. "I didn't know," he said. Elias looked at him calmly. "That's the problem. No one asked." 15 minutes passed. When the court resumed, Judge Sandell called both legal teams into sidebar. Her voice was firm, low, and decisive. Afterward, she turned to the room. New evidence has been accepted into the record, she said. We will reopen testimony for examination. The courtroom air was thick now, not with drama, but with quiet reckoning. Dean called Elias back to the stand. This time, he didn't just verify a document. He told the story of Curtis Lane, how he met him, how he'd seen him speak with Mason, how Curtis, a man the system discarded, had written his truth on napkins from a soup kitchen. Then came the moment that cracked the room open. Dean asked, "Mr. Monroe, why didn't you submit this through official channels?" Elias answered softly, "Because official channels don't often listen to unofficial people." "And why did you come personally?" He looked out across the courtroom, not at the judge, not at the prosecutor, but directly at Mason. Because he needed someone to show up. Silence. Then the gallery half full of reporters, students, clerks breathed in unison. And then came the turn. The door in the back of the room opened, and in walked Colonel Janice Everett, retired judge advocate, currently serving as State Judicial Oversight Director and daughter of Elias Monroe's late colleague from 20 years ago. She hadn't come for ceremony. She came because she'd received a ping from the oversight liaison. And when she saw Elias on the stand, she didn't sit. She walked forward, approached the bench, and requested to be recognized. "Your Honor," she said, "I'm here on behalf of the State Judicial Ethics Office. I've been briefed. I'm here to observe and validate identity in regard to Mr. Monroe." Sandel nodded. "You are free to confirm." Janice turned to the courtroom, calm, authoritative. "For the record, Mr. Elias Monroe is a decorated ethics advisor, former tenured professor, and served on advisory boards at the federal and state level for over 2 decades. His testimony carries legal standing, and his presence here today was not just authorized, it was earned." She turned to Elias and added gently, "I'm sorry this room didn't know who you were, but I'm not surprised you showed up anyway." Elias simply lowered his gaze, not in shame, in grace, because it had never been about being known. It had always been about being heard. The judge asked Mason if he'd like to speak. He hesitated, then stood, and with a shaking voice, he said, "I thought nobody saw me," but he did. Those 5 words did more than any opening statement ever could. A ripple went through the courtroom, not dramatic, not loud, but deeply human. That's when the story left the courtroom. Not officially, but through the hand of a law clerk sitting in the back row who had been live typing for accessibility notes and quietly sent an internal memo to her class group chat. Within 30 minutes, screenshots began circulating. Former Judicial Ethics Chair, wrongfully cuffed, trying to defend teen. By the time the court adjourned, local journalists were waiting outside the courthouse steps. But Elias didn't speak. He walked out the way he came in, quietly. But this time, no one mistook that quiet for absence. Because now, the room had changed. It had remembered. The judge didn't bang the gavel. She didn't need to. When court recessed that afternoon, no one moved right away. People lingered not because they were confused, but because they knew something had shifted. The kind of shift that doesn't announce itself, but settles into the bones. Elias Monroe didn't make a speech. He didn't claim a victory. He simply gathered his coat, nodded once to the court officer nearest him, and stepped outside into the hallway where his day had begun. But this time, people made space. Not out of fear, out of respect, out of something even deeper than that, an understanding that presence doesn't have to be loud to carry weight. As he walked past the gallery, one of the younger law students stood instinctively. The others followed. No one told them to. They just did. Elias didn't acknowledge it, because to do so would have made it about him, and it never had been. Back outside, the air had warmed slightly. The snow hadn't come, but the light had changed, the kind of light that feels earned, like the sky itself is starting over. He crossed the courthouse plaza without a word. He had no interest in cameras. Reporters called after him. Someone asked for a statement. Someone else shouted, "Sir, what would you say to the people watching online?" He didn't even glance back. Because the real answer was this. If they're watching now, they weren't watching when it mattered. At the bus stop across the street, a woman with a toddler tugged off her gloves and handed him a paper cup of coffee. She didn't say anything either. He took it with a nod. That was enough. Back inside the courthouse, discussions erupted. Legal interns debated precedent. Officers reviewed policy. One of the senior clerks dug out old records of civilian submissions, quietly wondering how many had been dismissed before anyone read them. But Elias wasn't part of those conversations. He was walking 3 blocks north to the city library. At 2:15 p.m., he unlocked the side door with his janitorial passcode, not because he was cleaning that day, but because that's where he stored the lesson plans. Once a week, after hours, Elias led a quiet study group for at-risk teens, most of them on probation, some in group homes, a few just trying to stay out of the system. He didn't teach law. He taught resilience. And that afternoon, he taught as usual. Except the room wasn't usual anymore. The kids had seen the story. One had already clipped the courtroom video and added subtitles. Another had made a TikTok edit with the caption, "He didn't raise his voice. He raised the bar." They stared at Elias like he had just stepped off a battlefield. He didn't play into it. He erased the whiteboard, wrote, "What power looks like," and turned to face them. "I'm not here to talk about court," he said, his voice measured. "I'm here to talk about control. The kind no one can take from you, not even in handcuffs." One of the boys raised his hand. "But why didn't you say who you were?" Elias looked at him for a moment, then replied, "Because if my dignity only exists when people know my title, it was never real to begin with." A hush fell over the room. Then he asked them to take out paper. Assignment. Describe a moment you were misunderstood, but didn't fight back, and what it cost you, and what it taught you. No one protested the prompt, because they all had answers. Across town, Officer Bray sat at a temporary desk, filling out a written report, not under arrest, not yet disciplined, but under review. He kept writing, pausing occasionally to glance at a printed article with Elias's photo on it. The caption read, "He didn't demand justice, he embodied it." At the top corner, someone had scribbled in blue pen, "What did we miss?" It haunted him. He remembered the man's calm, the way he'd offered explanation instead of excuses, the way he'd obeyed without surrendering, how every word had felt measured, earned, not performative. He wondered, what does it feel like to carry yourself like that? What does it take to remain whole in the face of small humiliations? Back at the library, Elias closed the session with a quote. It wasn't his own. It belonged to Baldwin. "It is not a romantic matter. It is the unutterable truth. All men are brothers. That's the truth we have to accept. That's the responsibility." Then he added, "Some truths can't be shouted, but they can be lived." He dismissed the group early, not because they needed less time, but because sometimes the best teaching happens in the silence after words have landed. Later that week, the Judicial Ethics Board issued a formal statement. It didn't name Elias. It didn't reference the courtroom directly. It simply acknowledged that civic actors must be recognized for their full identities, not just their visible roles, and that unquestioned authority is not the same as earned authority. In classrooms across the state, professors began referencing the incident as a live case study in moral leadership, not because Elias had sued or scolded, but because he had remained still in a moment that begged him to break. The prosecutor in Mason Everett's case quietly withdrew the charge. Mason's record was sealed. His attorney submitted a request for youth rehabilitation services instead of sentencing. Mason didn't know how to thank Elias. He sent a handwritten note. "You didn't yell for me, but you stood, and I saw you." Elias folded it and tucked it into his coat pocket, next to the same inside pocket where he had once kept the statement from Curtis Lane. They were both there now. One from a man no one believed. One from a boy no one saw. And somehow, together, they made a bridge. The story never made national news. There were no banners, no breaking news alerts, no interviews on the evening broadcasts. Elias Monroe didn't trend. No hashtags, no angry commentary wars on cable. It slipped beneath the radar, but not beneath the surface. At a small civic engagement class in Bloomington High School, a social studies teacher printed out an excerpt from Elias's courtroom testimony and pinned it to the whiteboard. It read, "I didn't need her to see a title, I needed her to see a man." He didn't explain it to the class. He simply told them to read it and reflect. Across town, in a legal ethics seminar at St. Olaf College, a professor asked his students, "Is there a difference between silence that protects power and silence that preserves dignity?" The question came after they'd watched a grainy, uncaptioned clip of Elias being uncuffed in the hallway. One student asked, "Who is he?" The professor answered, "Exactly." At the Jackson County Public Library, where Elias had volunteered for the last 5 years, a quiet renovation took place. No media, no donors, just a group of librarians and local teens, most of whom had once sat in Elias's after-hours study group. They repainted the walls, replaced the cracked chairs, rearranged the bookshelves so that more sunlight filtered through the tall, narrow windows in the west wing. Above the doorway, someone hung a new wooden plaque. "The Monroe Room," for those who were almost overlooked. They didn't ask Elias for permission. They didn't need to, because it wasn't about honoring him. It was about creating a space that looked like what he had given: room to be seen, room to speak, room to return without shame. When Elias walked in and saw the sign for the first time, he didn't cry. He didn't take a photo. He simply sat down, opened a worn paperback of Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, and resumed reading. A young girl passed by, no older than 10, and pointed at the sign. "Is that named after you?" Elias smiled faintly. "In a way." She nodded, then asked, "Why?" He closed the book. "Because sometimes the best things we leave behind aren't our names. They're the spaces we make for others." The girl didn't fully understand, not yet, but she would. And when she did, she'd remember the man in the gray coat who didn't say much, but never had to. Meanwhile, Officer Bray quietly resigned. No scandal, no lawsuits, just a resignation letter submitted without ceremony. He packed his locker slowly, pausing at the folded photo of his academy graduation. Before leaving, he taped something to the inside of his locker door. "You saw a type, and you acted on it." No signature, just acknowledgement. At the state level, a judicial ethics subcommittee passed a resolution requiring implicit bias training for all courthouse security personnel. It wasn't branded, it wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Because the case they used in training didn't have a name. It had a moment, a hallway, a misunderstanding, a man who stood still while others collapsed under their own assumptions. That was the curriculum. And in law schools, across 3 states, that moment became part of required reading. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. Elias never returned to the courthouse again. Not because he was bitter, because the work was done. He continued his library sessions, mentored 3 former probation teens into full scholarships, and began writing again, not for courts, but for classrooms. Short essays, quiet reflections. One of them was published in a regional journal. It ended with this line: "Dignity is not a rebuttal. It is a presence that refuses to vanish." By the spring of the following year, Mason Everett had completed his rehabilitation program. He applied for community college. His record was sealed, but his memory wasn't. He returned to the Monroe Room one afternoon and found Elias shelving books. They didn't hug. They didn't cry. Mason simply said, "I never forgot what you didn't say." Elias smiled. "Then you understood." And that was enough. In that room, lined with soft chairs, secondhand books, and the faint smell of old carpet and new learning, a generation began to grow, quietly, steadily, fully seen. No trophies, No headlines, just presence. And sometimes, that's what legacy looks like. Have you ever stood in a room where no one saw you? Where your presence felt like an afterthought? Or worse, a threat? Elias Monroe didn't raise his voice. He didn't wear a uniform. But in the stillness, he reminded us that strength isn't always loudened. Dignity doesn't need permission to exist. Maybe you've been there too. Overlooked, misunderstood, judged before you could even speak. And if you have, this story isn't just about Elias. It's about you. About every person who's ever had to prove they belonged when they should have simply been seen. But here's the truth. You are not invisible. And your silence? It doesn't mean weakness. It means restraint. It means you're choosing something bigger than reaction. You're choosing presence. So if this story moved you, I invite you genuinely to subscribe to the channel. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And tell us in the comments, have you ever been in a room where you had to fight to be seen? Because your story matters here. Your voice belongs here. And remember, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stand tall even when no one is looking. Dignity is not a rebuttal. It is a presence that refuses to vanish. I'll see you in the next story. Stay tuned.